So yeah, I'm here to talk about tissue engineering and the work we've done in the lab next door. It is, as Paolo said, really exciting. We're moving to a really exciting phase. But before we do that, it would be great if we could gather some of your perspectives in advance of what I'm going to say. Then I'm going to show you what we have done, and then we want to gather your perspectives at the end. Not to change your mind, but just to see if your mind has changed. So if you have a phone, if you can either scan this QR code, or if you go to www.menti.com and put that number in, then you can take part in a survey that we're all going to do together. You don't have to put your name in, it's completely anonymous, and there is absolutely no judgment here. So I'll just give you a minute to get that up. Oh, you've already started. That's brilliant. Okay. So just to try and understand who you are, why you're here today, I'll give a bit more time so that, can I have a show of hands if you've done it? Okay, I'm going to move on if that's okay. So the next question is, have you heard of tissue engineering before? So yes, I've read about it, yes, but I don't know much about it. Or no, never heard of it before today or before you saw it on the agenda for this meeting. Cool. Lots of people who seem to know a lot. Good one. Okie doke. And I'll move on to the next one. If you've heard of tissue engineering, where have you heard about it before? So was it through the charity, online, in news outlets, sci-fi, from a medical profession, or another source? Oh, TOFS are doing very well here. Excellent work. Okay, and if you have any, what are your perceptions of tissue engineering at this point? And we will ask you this question at the end. Brilliant. And finally, any words that might come to your mind that you would associate with tissue engineering? This is the last question, I promise. Anything. We don't mind. Oh, lovely. Oh, these are some great words. Okay, well, I'll leave that open. Oh my gosh, so many. Wow. Okay, so at the end, let's see if any of these change. So there's some to pick out there. Complicated, scary, guinea pig, animal testing, tricky, definitely true, fiction. Okay, so I'll close that for now. So why are we talking about tissue engineering today? Why is it important to TOFS? Why is it important to you as a community of esophageal atresia patients and parents? I'm sure some of you may know that there are 5 main types of esophageal atresia, and this one you can see in the middle is the most common. So you have a fistula between the lower esophagus and the windpipe. But about 10% of patients have a slightly more tricky variety, and that's something called long gap, which I'm sure you've heard of. Which there is no fistula, if you can see there, between the lower esophagus and the windpipe. And what that means is there's a much longer gap for us to try and join surgically. And so it's much more difficult in the first few days of life to just do a direct join and join the esophagus back together. And the reality for patients with long gap, and I'm sure some of you can tell me this better than I can tell you, is that within the first days of life, instead of having a corrective and definitive treatment, we actually have to perform a gastrostomy, which is to place a tube in the stomach to allow them to feed, and assess how big that gap is before waiting a period of sometimes several months before the baby has grown enough and the esophagus has grown enough for us to make a direct join. And actually, that's not even possible in 50% of these patients, so we're still unable to make a direct join. And in that scenario, we need to think of alternative solutions. And actually, for the last 100 years, these solutions that are on the screen have been the standard of care. So making the stomach or your bowel into a tube that we put into the chest to join your throat to your stomach. And that surgery works, but it's also associated with chronic and very difficult long-term problems for these patients, as I'm sure some of you know very well. So we need other solutions, and we're looking for new solutions. So the first question is, everybody knows that we can transplant organs, so why can't we transplant the esophagus? Well, these are some of the 4 most commonly transplanted organs in the country at the moment. We have the kidney, the heart, the liver, the lung. And the main unifying feature about all of those is that they've got 1 or 2 major blood vessels, huge blood vessels, that we can use to plumb back in to the patient. But the esophagus has got many very tiny blood vessels the entire way down. There's not one single blood supply that we can use to connect. And so that's sort of the equivalent of operating on a motorway compared to operating on 10 to 20 country roads. And the other difficulty with organ transplant, as I'm sure you'll know, is that there are limited donors available, and also it requires lifelong immunosuppressant drugs. So what else can we do? Well, you may have heard of a technique called the FOCA, which is where we place stitches on both ends of the esophagus to try and winch them together over time. But it's sort of equivalent to this Herculean holds that you can see this man doing here. So that puts the 2 esophageal ends under really significant tension. And sometimes that can cause more damage to the esophagus than just trying to do the other surgical techniques. So we still need another new approach. Now, regenerative medicine is the term that we use, which encompasses, it's an umbrella term for a really new field of science, where we're trying to harness the body's ability to self-heal. And this is in axolotl. I don't know if any of you know anything about these, but it's a type of salamander, a particularly cute type of salamander. And if they lose their limb for any reason, they can grow it back. They can grow back the muscles, the bones, the fingers. It's absolutely amazing. Now, no one knows why this animal is able to do this. It's certainly under huge investigation by the scientific community. But what we do know is that humans do not have this same ability. If we lose a limb, if we're born without an organ, we can't replace it. We can heal, but we heal with a scar. And tissue engineering is about, rather than focusing on self-healing, it's about creating an organ in a lab that we could then use to transplant into a patient who is either born without that organ or who has a diseased or damaged organ in place. And to do that, we need 3 main things. We need cells as the building blocks for the organ. We need a scaffold for the cells to sit on. And we need this thing called bioactive molecules, which can mean many things. But it essentially creates the right environment for those cells to thrive and be healthy within that scaffold. Is it sci-fi? No, it's not sci-fi. It's happening. So what you can see on the screen is at the top a skin graft made in a lab, an artery, a cornea, which is a part of your eye, and actually a trachea, which was performed by Professor Tekopi here in 2010 and then in the years after that. So it is really happening. And what about the esophagus? Well, you will be amazed to hear that in the 1850s, somebody used ivory to reconstruct a long segment of missing esophagus. I am pleased to tell you that people are not doing that anymore. But in the past, plastics, metal have all been used to try and do that. The problem is that the approach of just using one solid thing neglects the fact that the esophagus is not just a tube. As you all well know, it needs to be able to swallow, it needs to work as a muscle. And so what do we need to build an esophagus? Well, we need the muscle, which we need to be able to contract. We need nerves, which can stimulate and coordinate that contraction. We need blood vessels, which help give the muscle the oxygen and nutrients it needs to do that job. And there's also this inner lining, the mucosa, which is a barrier. So if you eat anything hot or acidic, like acid juice, don't eat that, orange juice, it will stop your esophagus from becoming damaged. So our idea is not just to make one of those layers, to try and reconstruct that entire layer and be able to use it in long-gap patients as a better treatment to what they currently have. And that is what Paolo and his team, including myself and Marco, have been working on, honestly, for the last 15 years. Not me, but Paolo, overseeing it all. And so what we envisage, the way we envisage this being ideally used in a patient is that a patient born with long gap esophageal atresia would, when they have their routine gastrostomy and gap assessment in the first days of life, we have access to the tummy wall and we can take a tiny piece of muscle, like by tiny I mean a 5mm piece of muscle. And from that we can grow cells in the lab, which we can then deliver to a scaffold, place in a bioreactor, which is in a liquid, a special broth with all the right nutrients in it to help supply those cells and encourage them to grow in the way we want. And then ideally, once the child's grown a tiny bit, place it back in as a transplant. So how close are we to actually doing that? Well, Nigel was down that end of the spectrum. We're down this end, still very much in the basic research stage. And obviously, this is a really meticulous and you cannot deviate from this pathway. Okay, this is the high bodies, governmental level pathway. So we are still really early on in that. But obviously, we need to stick to this really closely to make sure that if we were to do something like this, it is completely safe for patients, but also that it actually works. And so how do we make our grafts? Well, this is how we make our scaffold. We take a donor esophagus. We then wash it with antibiotics, mild detergents, and enzymes to remove all the cells from it. And that leaves us with a sterile scaffold at the end of that process. So what you can see on the screen is a normal esophagus at the top, which has had none of that done to it, and then an esophagus after we've done all those processes. So all the cells have been removed, and it's essentially just a tube. So that's what it looks like in the lab, but I like to think of it more like a tree that's had its leaves removed, and it's just leaving that framework for us with really essential proteins, but no cells. So the collagen and the elastin, like you would have in your face cream, which can provide the right environment to nurture cells. Then we need cells. So this muscle biopsy I've told you about, we place it in a special broth in the lab in a dish, and which encourages the right stem cells to come out of that tissue from the patient, which we can then use to place back in the scaffold. And I say in a dish in the lab, this is reality. This is all the flasks it used on the last day just to create one graft. I mean, that is months worth of evolution and work. And finally, how do we deliver these cells back to the scaffold? But this is what we do. We put the cells in a syringe and we inject them meticulously, piece by piece, along the whole course of our scaffold. And then we place it in this bioreactor, you can see on the right-hand side, and we put flow on the inside and on the outside to encourage the muscle cells, the muscle stem cells, to start developing into more mature muscle. So how close are we now? That's all the lab work. The next step is this preclinical testing step. And I'm really excited to say that actually in the last year, we've made a major milestone by doing that for the first time. So in order to make sure this is safe, the only way to do that is by using animal testing. And we place these grafts in a pig, a 2.5 centimetre graft, using the same process that we would expect to do in a child born with esophageal atresia, to see what happened. And we had almost unanticipatedly brilliant results. So the animals recovered brilliantly. They were feeding the next day. We didn't need any gastrostomies. They were feeding through our graft the next day. And one of them even needed an endoscopy, which was unanticipated on day 3, because she'd eaten a blanket. And it blocked her graft. But what's great about that is that we did the endoscopy. It took me 2.5 hours to remove every single fragment of this blanket. The graft was intact the entire time. It didn't break. We had no leaks. It was brilliant. We had no rejection. We did have strictures, which wasn't a surprise. We were expecting to have strictures. But that was only when the stent which we'd put in to hold it open initially, which was due to dissolve, when it either dissolved or when it moved. And all of the strictures that we saw, we were able to treat endoscopically, just like you would with a balloon dilatation in a child. And we didn't need any stents after 4 months. And this, you can see on the right, is the growth of these animals over time. So by 6 months, the growth had reached control animals that hadn't been operated on. So their growth was essentially normal for a pig that hadn't had an operation. This is a video of an endoscopy, so if you don't like seeing squeamish things or endoscopies, then please look away. I imagine you're all fairly used to this sort of thing. This is at 6 months, okay, the end of our experiment. I ask you to tell me where the graft is, because we didn't know. What you can see is a stitch up there on the top right. I'll just play it again. So the only thing that could tell us where the graft was a stitch there, top left. So this is now all graft and food, and the stitch there. So we couldn't tell the difference between the normal esophagus and the graft, which was amazing. So what's next? Well, we are obviously really excited about this. We think we're close now to being able to start talking about putting this in patients. And just as Nigel said, you know, Nigel was at the end of that pathway with his study. We're at the beginning of that pathway, and your views are so important to us because we need to know what you find acceptable. You're the patients and the parents of patients, and this obviously is unlikely to help you at this point, but it certainly could help the next generation. So we are really looking for your feedback. We're looking to start a PPI focus group, and if you are willing to help in that way, if you could give your names to Diane at the end, I don't know where she is, I'm sure she's agreed to collect them for me, then we would love to hear from you and start creating engagement with you as a community as to how we take this forward together. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to go through some questions with you at the end just to see whether that's changed your perception. So if you could log back, you may not have logged out, so go back to the internet page and I'll get it back up. So let's see. Although I don't know the answers from before, because I didn't write them down. But I do know that that's changed, I can see, which is amazing. Any words that you'd associate with tissue engineering now? God, it's going to make me cry. Wow, thank you. I wonder if the person that wrote guinea pig on the first one wrote pig just now. Is that what happened? Okay, these are really important questions, and this is something we'd hope to explore a bit more with a focus group. But would you be worried about your child's cells being grown in a lab? Gosh, brilliant. Would you be opposed to the use of animal products in a tissue-engineered esophagus that we created? And if so, it's totally fine. If so, why? What would your reasoning be? Okay, and does anything else specific worry you about this process? Double strictures is really interesting. Is that presumably as in because we've got two joins? Or what does, yeah, very valid. Yeah, okay. And last one, would you potentially be interested in being involved in a focus group with us about developing this in the future? Yeah. Simon's just raised a really good point with me that it's really important to have people that have not, have negative views of this as well, so that it's a balanced argument. It's honestly wonderful to see so many of you so positive about this, but if you are feeling unsure about this, that's equally as valuable, if not more valuable, because it means we can address those concerns early on. That's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking part in this.
Is there any question for Natalie? Natalie, she's gonna stay for lunch, so they're gonna be able to have a please, yeah.
So is this anticipated for a very young child, or do you anticipate in the future being able to grow one for an adult in case, you know, like the damage over time might lead to a...
Absolutely. I mean, it's an excellent question. Our anticipated, so that, by the way, would be one thing we'd need to discuss with you guys in, you know, in a focus group. But our anticipated use, our ideal use for this would be as a first-line solution for a baby born with long gap esophageal atresia that we weren't able to do a delayed join in. Rather than doing this current standard therapy of a gastric pull-up or a, you know, colonic interposition, we would do this first. That would be our ideal use. And what I didn't show today, but what was really amazing is that when we went back into the chest in these animals, there were really no adhesion. It was almost like we hadn't operated there. So our feeling is it hasn't compromised the later use of any of the alternative strategies that we could then, that are currently first line, but we could then use them later on. I.e., we can still do a gastric pull-up on these patients, even if we've tried this first and it didn't work. There are quite a few other indications that we could use this for, so maybe not a baby first born with long gap esophageal atresia, certainly yes, later on if this technology were more advanced. Also, children who've, you know, swallowed button batteries and had significant damage to their esophagus, strictures for any other reason. And yes, people in the the tissue engineering community do envisage these sorts of approaches as a treatment for cancer in adults. I mean, esophageal cancer is the 7th most common cancer in the UK. Seventh highest cause of mortality in the UK from a cancer cause. So yes, this would be amazing if we could use it for that approach. But at the moment we've used 2.5 centimetres, it's quite a short section. Everything has been optimised for a 10 kilo child at the moment. That doesn't mean we can't change it, but that's why we envisage the first use being in that scenario.